Well, I'm glad to be here, although this is kind of a little weird on Zoom. But so I want to tell you about this thing which is called the farthest point map. It's also going to just kind of bring up some basic notions in geometry and algebra, which I'll talk about too. Let me say the problem first, and then start talking about more particular. So the setup is you have, let me get a better pen. You have some kind of body like a cube, and you pick a point on it, P0, and then you look for all the points that are farthest away from it. This is maybe a kind of a recreational problem in math. Like, so there's some other point which is farthest away from it, and there's if you have say the surface of a cube, there's two ways that you could do this. One way is you could say, what's the farthest point just in terms of the distance in three-dimensional space? And in that case, it's not that interesting because the farthest point is always going to be a vertex of the cube. And the way to think about that is, imagine something like a big sphere that's centered at this point. And now imagine this thing just kind of like shrinking like a balloon. And then when it first hits, that's going to be the point that's farthest away. And if you think about it, this thing's going to hit at a vertex. So this isn't so interesting. No matter where you start, you end up at a vertex. And then if you start at a vertex, you get to another one, and so on. It might be interesting, like if you had a polyhedron with many, many sides, or say in higher dimensions, and you could ask like which vertices do you hit, and it's sort of a combinatorial problem. But that's not quite what I'm going to talk about. There's another way to measure distances on say the surface of a cube, or really any polyhedron. And what you do is you look at paths on the cube that stay on the surface, and then you take the minimum length of all the paths that join 2 points, and you call that the intrinsic distance between the points. So this way of measuring distances is like what would happen if you were sort of like a two-dimensional creature that was trapped on the surface. And then it turns out it's no longer true that the farthest point, say for a cube or some other polyhedron, is a vertex. It's going to be more complicated. So this is the problem I'm going to talk about, and I'm really going to focus on the regular octahedron. So maybe I'll say a few minutes about how I got interested in this. I mean, I learned about this problem from my friend Peter Doyle, who's a professor at Dartmouth College. And Peter had an undergraduate student working on this named Annie Laurie Moss Pugh. And Annie Laurie had written some stuff about this for an honors thesis, but never really solved it, just sort of made some partial progress. And then some years after she graduated, I said, well, Peter, you should really use the computer to try to understand this thing. So in the end, what I did was I did a bunch of computer experiments and finally figured out what was going on. So maybe before I say what's going on, I want to talk about what's the nature of the computer experiments, because there's this one technique which I've used 50,000 times. It's sort of the only thing I know, but it's worth knowing. There's something called, people sometimes call this a hill climbing algorithm, or some people, it's also sometimes called stochastic gradient flow. What it is you've got some function, you've got some space, in my case, it would be the regular octahedron, and then you've got some function on it, and you want to maximize this function. And the question is, what do you do if you don't know anything more than the function? One sophisticated thing you could try to do is you could try to compute the gradient of the function and then move along the gradient. And this would take you towards a max, or at least a local max. But what do you do if you're too lazy even to compute the gradient? Or maybe it's not a smooth function, it's just a continuous function. So what you do is you just randomly pick a point, and then you kind of send out scouts, and you pick kind of nearby neighboring points. And if you can find a point where the function is higher, you just move to the new point, and then you repeat. And the art in doing this is sort of deciding like how far you move out. So the idea is like, usually you should just move out a little bit, and then occasionally you should take a big jump to avoid getting stuck in some kind of local well. So, you make some kind of, with some probability you move out like 1/2, and with some probability 1/4 and 1/8. And what's really good about this thing is that if there was a gradient, if the function had a gradient, then 50% of the time you're sort of moving in the direction of the gradient anyway. So even though this thing doesn't know what the gradient is, it actually more or less, by just accepting the things that that increase the function, this thing sort of simulates gradient flow. And if you run it on the computer, it actually looks a lot like gradient flow if you take small steps. So anyway, when I got interested in this problem, I just made a program that draws the regular octahedron and then does this process. And I sort of, after looking at this thing for a long time, I figured out what was going on. So anyway, that's the experiment. I mentioned this just because if you ever have some problem like this, some kind of optimization problem, I recommend hill climbing as an experimental method for figuring out what the thing does. So now we're on the regular octahedron. I want to talk a little bit about this intrinsic distance. If you haven't thought about this before, it's really a weird and amazing thing. Okay, so that's an octahedron, more or less. And what's amazing about the intrinsic metric is that if you go over an edge, it's completely indistinguishable from two equilateral triangles just sitting in the plane intrinsically. So if you were a creature embedded in this surface, you would think that the thing was completely flat, like a piece of paper, except for the 6 cone points. And the 6 cone points, you don't even see the edges around them. In fact, like, you would sort of think you were something like like what it would look like is you would take like 4 equilateral triangles and stick them together, and then you'd cut this stuff out of the board, and then you'd glue it together. This would make like an ice cream cone. So somehow the regular octahedron, or really any polyhedron with its intrinsic metric, it's flat everywhere except for a finite number of points where it looks like an ice cream cone. So that's a pretty neat thing. These things are sometimes called flat cone surfaces. So any questions so far?
Do we need to include anything else but just which edges we cross on the way? Because, for example,
no, that's a great observation.
Is it just combinatorially counting which combination of edges are we going? Or is there anything?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a mixture. Okay, so it's a mixture of combinatorics and geometry, because you might be able to get round to the same point in several different directions, and I'm gonna talk more about that in a little bit. So there might be, for example, like if you think about the surface of a sphere and you're going from, say, the North Pole to the South Pole. Mm-hmm. There's many different ways you can get there that have exactly the same length, and on something like a the regular octahedron, that's also going to happen. I'm going to draw pictures of this in a little bit.
Yeah, perhaps I can quickly paraphrase. Sorry to interrupt so early. Are there 2 paths that are both length minimizing, but go through the exact same sequence of edges?
No. Right. Once you keep track of some sequence of edges, you could then say, well, how do I actually get to the point? So this brings up, like, so there's a nice calculational tool for this, and people call it the unfolding map. You could do this for any polyhedron, but it's especially nice for the regular octahedron. What you do is you imagine that the octahedron is like sitting on one of these triangles, and then you just kind of roll it around to the next one and the next one. And this process is a little bit vague the way I'm saying it. Like, you could just say you take the thing and you start rolling it every which way. If you've learned about this in an algebraic topology class, I'll tell you that the right thing to do is you remove the vertices, you take the universal cover, and then you roll the universal cover around into the plane. But if you haven't had an algebraic topology class and you don't know what the universal cover is, just forget about what I said, because you're only looking for kind of, get paths that go all the way around. So you don't really have to roll that much of it. Really, what you do, I'll kind of draw sort of what I'll call the playing field. So this one's sort of the home base. Well, there are two ways to think about it. You roll the octahedron out into this thing, but then you can also roll this thing back up onto the octahedron. The way to think about this is like you have an octahedron and it's a present for somebody. And here's your wrapping paper. And you just go like this. And there's a little aid to figure this out. Like there's a coloring of the vertices, say black, pink, and X. And the coloring, you propagate it by whatever the color is here, it's the same across from it. So I think I said black, but I'm using green. So maybe let me switch to black. Okay, there you go. So each vertex is colored one of three colors. And the idea is that, so there's sort of a one face of the octahedron, and then there's another face which is on the other side, which is called the antipodal face. And all of these six regions, they all wrap up to the antipodal face. So you have to sort of picture this thing just kind of sitting above this, and then when you fold it up, it just all these six of them close up, and the colors indicate where the vertices go, so that like this point here goes to the same place as this point here. So if I have a point over here, like right here, which is sort of fairly near the pink, it's the same as this point over here. And also it's the same as this point over here, and the same as this point over here, and this point over here, and this point over here. So all of these 6 points I've drawn, they're in the same position. When I fold it up, all these red points go to the same point. So this sets up like what you could call a competition. Like, you have some point here, and you want to know like how far is it to this red point? Well, the red point's on the other face, and you unroll the thing, and then you measure these 6 distances, and you take the shortest one. So this is maybe answering Misha's question.
Yeah, thank you. In that picture, it becomes very clear. Yeah. Yeah.
This is the thing. So, okay. So now I'm going to tell you about a new. So you could imagine. So there's this like I wrote this program which I'm going to show you in a minute, and I called it Spider's Embrace. And the reason for the name is that, well, it's a 6-sided spider. Like you've got this point, and it reaches out to these 6 points, and you want to measure the distance, and usually one of the legs is shortest, and that's the that would be sort of the distance between those 2 points. So you can use this thing to compute different distances. So now I'm going to tell you there's another object in geometry which is called the cut locus. It might turn out like if you fix a point. So I'm going to fix the point here, and I'm going to sort of look at distances to this point. The answer would change if I move this point, but anyway, certain of these red points are going to have the property that there's more than one of these spider's legs that has exactly the same length that reaches it. And in fact, if some point has that property, if you think about it sort of kind of abstractly, imagine instead your point is here and these spider legs are the same distance, then there's really kind of like a whole line of things where they're equidistant. So in fact, if you can find a point where there's 2 spider's legs that are the same distance, there's a little line that also has that property. So there's some thing like this where everything in this line, say this spider leg and this spider leg, I guess it would look like this. They'd really be the same arc, and everything would be exactly the same. I'm going to show you guys pictures of this in a minute. And then there's something which is even neater that happens. You've got these various kinds of red arcs of kind of like the points where there's ties, but then there could be a 3-way tie. And then you would see some picture like this. So actually, if you look at the set of all points where there's ties, this object is known as the cut locus, and it's a graph in the octahedron, and usually it's got this kind of like prong type singularities, but depending on which point you pick, there might be 4 or more coming in. Anyway, this is some kind of basic object in geometry, and people often study it when they study Riemannian geometry. Like it's the same kind of thing. You're looking for like all the points where the shortest path where there's more than one. So let me share my screen with you. I'm going to show you this program. So there are these 6 outer triangles. I see a chat. Let me.
Well, I was just wondering about the diagram you drew on the board. What the colors on the vertices represent? Like those aren't the same.
So
vertices.
okay, so on the octahedron has 6 vertices,
Right.
and you can color them in 3 colors so that opposite vertices get the same color.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And then these colors are the ones, they're like the pre-images, so to speak, under the map to the octahedron.
Thank you.
Great. Anyway, that's how I was able to, that's how my program figures out. So if you look at this picture in one of these triangles, this is the cut locus with respect to the point in the middle. And if you look in the other triangles, it's the same picture. It's just been rotated according to the coloring of the dots. So you can sort of see. Maybe I'll turn this off. I'll just draw the cut locus. So as I move around, my program is computing this cut locus. And so like in the center there, now I've turned off all the distracting features. I think I can even animate it. Yeah. So this shows like, here the point is moving around, and this is showing you how the cut locus changes as you go. Okay. So are you guys happy with what this cut locus is? Does it make sense? Somewhat. It's the set of points where when you go to that point, like these triple points, all these are 3 of the blue are 3 of the 6 spider's legs, and they all have the same length. So here I'm showing a point in the middle, and then I'm showing a particular point here where there's three ways to compute the distance, and you always get the same answer.
Sorry, just to clarify, so you have the triangle in the middle made of 4 little triangles, right? And then on each side you have 2 which represent the same one, and then the 6 outer ones are all the opposite.
Right. So that's right. So that's right. So the inner one, it's just sort of uniquely representing the bottom of the octahedron. These 3 neighbors likewise are uniquely representing points on the octahedron, and then these 2 get kind of folded in together, and so do these 2, and so do these 2, and then the outer 6 all just go on top.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
So basically what I did is, I didn't want to have to visualize this thing in space, so I eventually wrote this program which just draws it all out. Let me sort of show you a way of like you might wonder, like, how do I compute this in practice? How do you compute this thing? And what you do is, I'm just going to tell you the answer, and I'll also tell you that I got it wrong about 50 times in a row before I finally got it right. So it shouldn't be completely obvious how it works, but I'm just going to tell you what finally works. So there's a map that maps this triangle. I picked my favorite one, this one. And then there's maps that maps this to this, and this to this, and this to this. It maps all the outer ones to a single one. And I pick the central point, and I apply the map to all 6 of those points. Let me draw this. So what I've got here is I've got my central point where my cursor is, and then these other 6 points are carefully chosen points, which I get by I identify, say, this triangle with this triangle, and then I use that map to carry the point somewhere else. So I have the original point, and I have 5 identifications, and I just carry this point along with it. This will give me a hexagon. It's just the vertices of this hexagon. And then what I do is I form what's called the Voronoi decomposition. What I do is this triangle is now broken up into zones. Everything in this zone is closest to this point. Everything in this zone is closest to this point. So you can imagine that you have a bunch of, you know, people standing around, and then you can divide the room up into regions. Just all the points closest to person 1, all the points closest to person 2, and so on. People call that the Voronoi decomposition. And so this triangle here, it's coloring in some of the Voronoi decomposition with respect to these 6 points. And I could shade in the rest of it, but I didn't. I only shaded in this one. So what I do, again, the procedure is I start with the point in the middle. I move it to the 5 new location using these kind of natural maps. And then I take this Voronoi decomposition, and then I just kind of propagate it everywhere. And that gives me this graph that I was telling you about. Now, the last thing I want to say, which is I want to show you one more picture in this. See this red region? So this red region, like all the points not in the red region, there is a shorter spider's leg that's in the red region that reaches it. So the red region is sort of like, it's all the points where there's like a unique shortest path. And then the boundary is like the points where there's more than one. And in fact, this red region exactly wraps up and fits on the octahedron perfectly. So let me give an analogy again. Like when you're wrapping a present, there's often some overlap with your wrapping paper. And you may think to yourself like, well, how can I do a better job with the wrapping paper? Like, I don't really need it to sort of fold over so much. I can cut some of it away. And this red stuff is exactly the wrapping paper that you need to perfectly wrap the octahedron. And it's sort of like the biggest region where every point in here there's a unique shortest path. So, and then this boundary thing is this cut locus. So okay, so all right, so let me stop and ask you guys any questions. So far what I did was just I showed you this kind of playing field, and I tried to define the cut locus for you. And the cut locus is really, you construct it using this kind of auxiliary hexagon, and then you kind of make this red polygon, and that's the that's like the region, that's like the inside of where the cut locus is. So okay, so far I haven't been talking yet about, I've just been talking about the geometry of the octahedron, and now I want to relate this to the farthest point map. So I pick a point here, and here's the beautiful fact. The beautiful fact is that the farthest point is always a vertex of the cut locus. So let me try to give you some intuition for why that's true without really giving a formal proof. Let me stop the screen share for a minute, and then I'll come back to it. Now I'm going to draw kind of a caricature of what I had in the computer program. So I still have the playing field, and then I've got this thing which kind of goes, oh man, how does it go? You know, something like and then there's this kind of red part in here. So this is the region of points where there's a unique shortest straight line, and then the boundary is where there's ties. So I'm at, and it's all with respect to some point. If I move the point, as you saw, the shape moves around. So why couldn't this be the farthest point? Well, you know, there's this unique shortest path, and then, well, I could just push it a little bit further, and then that'll get a farther point. There's no other competitors. So the farthest points really have to be on the edge here. But what if they're not at a vertex? Well, then the picture is something like this. You sort of have this point here, and then here are these two things that are closest to it. But then you want to get further away, you can just slide along this line one way or the other. And that'll make the point go further away. And there's no other competitors because there's no third one that's closest. So if you're not a vertex of the cut locus, you can get further away. And people know this about some general kind of surface, like any convex surface in space, that the farthest point would have to be a place where at least three things come together. And that's more or less the argument I just gave you. If not, you just can sort of slide it along in one way or the other and make it farther away. So, okay, so now I'm gonna share the screen again. So I'd like to say that I actually discovered this by thinking about it. But in fact, I just kept doing numerical experiments and just drawing all possible pictures until I just sort of noticed that it was a vertex of the cut locus. Then I sort of realized there's this proof. If you're interested in figuring out what this map is, this simplifies the problem a lot because it tells you where to look for what the farthest point is. Let me do the screen share again. So now I'm moving around the central point and the cut locus is kind of changing. So now I'm going to turn on what I call the spider. It sets up a kind of competition. You've got, if you look at this thing, there's really four vertices, and one of them is going to be the farthest point away. But to measure the distance, you have to really look at all four of them and all of the triangles and then figure out which one's the farthest. So it turns out that in this case, this one's the winner. If you look closely, this one is closer, and so it loses. And you might say, well, why isn't this kind of dark one over here the winner? It's because if you look in this other triangle, it's a loser. So the ones that win are not losers in any of the other triangles. That's a way to say it. Like in some of the triangles, that one of them might look like it's further away, but if it's closer to another one, it loses. So you have to sort of run this six-way competition, and whichever one is not the loser is the winner. So anyway, the blue ones are sort of showing which one wins. So then, of course, I got organized. I'll turn on a little more stuff. Okay, so firstly, the regular octahedron has some symmetry. There's a group acting on the regular octahedron. It's the group of all, symmetries of the thing. And this triangle here that I'm drawing right here, this is what they would call a fundamental domain for the symmetry. It sort of has the property that if you move it around by the entire group, you tile the octahedron. So rather than understand what this farthest point map does all over the octahedron, you might as well just understand what it does in this fundamental triangle, because for the other ones, it follows from symmetry. So after a long time, I'm going to bring up a kind of disgusting equation. You look at this polynomial, x cubed minus x squared minus 4x plus 1, and one of its roots is 0.239. And then you plot this function from 0.239 to 0.25, and you see this thing which sort of looks like a j. I mean, and that j is the graph of this function. So here's the neat thing. Here's the j curve, this blue thing. And if I stay away from the j curve, the answer doesn't change. And then when I cross the j curve, the answer changes. So you might wonder, how did I find the j curve? I just looked at the picture long enough and figured out, when does this thing change? And like the j curve, if you look really closely at it, it's the place where these 2 points are kind of like equidistant. And so I eventually just computed what this thing was and got the equation for it. So there's two levels of things that are going on. If I turn off the spider, then inside this region, the picture of this graph does not change. The lengths change, but the combinatorics don't change. If I go to the boundary, it changes in various ways. Things come together. But at least in the middle, it doesn't change at all. And then the second level is like when I cross over the J curve, somehow the answer switches without the combinatorics of the thing changing. What I'm telling you is that this point's the winner on one side of the J curve, and then this point's the winner on the other. And before I prove that, I'll tell you its consequences, and then I'll go back and I'll explain the proof, at least in outline. Okay, so here's what I'm claiming without a proof, and then I'll get back to it, is that there's certain of the vertices are the winners, and I can tell you what they are, and that's the answer. That's the farthest point map. But it's neat. You can interpret this in kind of a dynamical systems point of view. And what a dynamical systems point of view is, you say, well, I start with a point, and then I pick the farthest point, and then I pick the farthest point from that, and so on. And I sort of watch this point kind of bouncing all over the octahedron. And, and I kind of look at what happens, and something really neat happens. So I'm going to look at something slightly different instead. Here's the octahedron. I'll call it O. So F stands for farthest point map. And so I could just look at, I could look at F squared, etc. And you could say, oh, I start with a point, like what happens? But I want to look at a slightly modified thing, which is nicer. I want to look at, there's another map. This is the antipodal map. So the antipodal map, every point on the octahedron has an opposite point. And so what I do is I look at it turns out that FA equals AF, just by symmetry. So they commute. So instead of looking at F, I look at FA, because it's nicer, because you pick a point that's, on one side and it goes to the other side, and then you map it back and it comes pretty close. So this thing's nicer. And what happens is, in this fundamental triangle, so I'll try to draw it like this. Here's the J curve. It turns out that there's a family of horizontal lines. And if I pick a point on this side of the J curve, it stays on the same horizontal line, and it just goes out a little bit. And everything kind of moves outward. And on the other side, it kind of moves this way. If some of you have taken a class in complex analysis or in hyperbolic geometry, you may have heard about things called linear fractional transformations. They're maps of the form like z goes to az plus b over cz plus d. And when you restrict fa to each of these line segments, it's a map like this. And it has a fixed point over here, and also over here. And the entire map is what people call birational. It's given by the quotient of two polynomials. So it's a birational map. It preserves the horizontal lines, and when restricted to each of these segments, it's a linear fractional transformation. And so what this means is that if I start with any point in the octahedron, and I start applying the far point map, it goes boom, 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 and it just pushes it to the edges. So the long-term behavior is that everything just goes into the edges. Or this edge. In the full octahedron, you have these kind of kite-shaped things, and the picture is that everything kind of pushes out to the kite-shaped thing. So that's sort of the final answer. Like it says, if you've had a dynamical systems class, I'll just tell you what it is. People are interested in this thing they call the omega limit set. And what it is you just pick points and you see where they go and where they accumulate. And that's what the omega limit set is. So what I'm saying is that the omega limit set of this map is just basically the edges of this kind of cell division of the regular octahedron. So I'm going to show you one more geometrical thing, and then the rest of the talk is algebra. I'm going to sort of show you what this map is geometrically. I worked it out. And I'll tell you again, I once had a kind of very elegant geometric proof in mind, but then in the end, when I wrote the paper, I just got lazy. And I just wrote the equations down, and said, here it is. It works. But I did take the time to actually, so so in this picture, the place where my cursor is the point x, and then the other point is fa of x. So what you do is you can be generated by a straight line construction. You take this big parallelogram and you start at this point and you draw the line to here and you see where it intersects this midline, and then you come down from here and you see where it intersects the same horizontal line, and that's the map. So that's sort of a geometric description of the far point map, and you can see how this sits with respect to the whole contraption. So it goes around, and here the description changes, but the map changes continuously, and then when you go through here, it actually kind of switches from the map to its inverse. So that's the final answer. The far point map on the octahedron, when you compose it with the antipodal map, it's given by this geometric construction. That's like the theorem. But now let me just kind of spend like the last 10 or 15 minutes just talking about algebra. And like, I would say that like the gold standard in a geometric proof, some kind of thing like this, is to find a nice geometric proof. You know, like when you want to prove the Pythagorean theorem, it's these beautiful proofs. But then sometimes there are these results which seem to be true, but they're hard to prove. And so I'm going to sort of tell you a technique to the sort of, you could call it like organized brute force. Like, how do you prove something algebraically if it's sort of, if the polynomials involved are too complicated to really just solve explicitly. So I'm going to sort of explain the issues and then explain this kind of method that I came up with called positive dominance. But I mean, the method I thought of is it joins a large host of other methods like this. So I mean, I like this one just because I'm familiar with it, but there's lots of things like it. So just kind of abstractly, like, again, you have this playing field and you have some point, and then there's this competition between the 4 points. It's really done in all the 6 regions, but you're basically trying to figure out which distance is the shortest, and you're claiming that a certain distance is always the best in a certain region. And so you have something like sort of like D1, D2, etc. And you want to show that like so these depend on some point x, for all x in some region. So it's better to use the squares, because then you get some kind of rational expression in x. It's just some kind of complicated several variable polynomial. I mean, maybe I should use the point p. So each of these things, like d1 squared is just some polynomial in x and y. And you're trying to show that like p1 minus p2 of xy is greater than or equal to 0 for all xy in some triangle. So this is the kind of thing that you're left with. And once you're done, you can then just kind of compute that the map is what it is. But so the question is like, how do you show that a polynomial of 2 variables is positive in a triangle? Let me start slowly, and let's talk about the unit interval. Like imagine I have a polynomial from 0 to 1. I mean, p of x is just a0 plus a1x plus. I want to show that p is, say greater than 0 on 0, 1. So what do? So here's something you can do. If all of these are positive, then the polynomial is positive. Let me give you a proof. So okay, so I'm going to try not to botch this proof. There's one idea. So a0, since x is between 0 and 1, this is greater than a0x plus a1x plus a2x squared plus etc. All I did was just multiply this single number by x, and I brought it down because this is positive, and then so this is smaller. So far, so good? But this is equal to, I can factor out an x, and I get a0 plus a1 plus a2x plus a3x squared, dot, dot, dot. And this polynomial satisfies the same criterion, but its degree is lower. And so this is positive by induction on the degree, and then I'm just multiplying by x. So that's a proof that if this criterion is true, then the polynomial is positive. So, okay, this is the vanilla version. Like, this criterion doesn't always work, but suppose I wanted to show that some polynomial was positive on 0, 1/2. Then what I do is I have my polynomial p like this, and I have my map here, call it, say, phi. Phi just shrinks. And if I look at p composed with phi, that's a polynomial on the unit interval again, and I can try my criterion. Now, if instead of 0, 1/2 I was using a very tiny interval, then when I pull back the polynomial and look at it here, most of the coefficients are very, very small, because like I'm taking x and I'm replacing it by x over a billion. So the first coefficient is dominating. And so this scheme, like if I'm interested in some small piece of this scheme is likely to work, because I'm likely to be left with a polynomial that does satisfy the criterion. So the idea is that if I want to know if a polynomial is positive on the unit interval, I try my criterion. If it fails, I subdivide the interval in half, and I try it on each of these. And then I just go through and I do like a depth first search through the intervals, and I just go down, and when I finally succeed, I have this kind of tree. And I run through it, and when the whole thing halts, I've proved it's positive. So this algorithm halts if and only if it's positive. So it's very robust. Okay, but I wasn't talking about polynomials of a single variable. I was really talking about polynomials of two variables. So suppose I want to know, like, is p of xy positive on 0, 1 squared? So what I do is I write out all the coefficients. So I take my polynomial and I write it out as like an array, and then I make these things like a alpha beta is like the sum of all aij with I less or equal to alpha, j less or equal to beta. So I put my finger somewhere and I just sum up all the things going to the left and up. And if all these are positive, then we're good. It's the same kind of argument. It's positive. And if this fails, I can kind of divide the thing up into quarters and retry it. So again, there's a kind of a subdivision algorithm which will verify it. So okay, almost done. Unfortunately, I don't have a square. I have a triangle. Like let's say I have the triangle like this. So if I look at this map, xy goes to xy, this is a polynomial map from the square to this triangle. And then if I have some other triangle, I can take some linear transformation. So if I have a polynomial coming out of here, I can compose it and get a polynomial coming out of here. And then I can try to use my subdivision algorithm to, so if I can show that this thing's positive, it implies this thing's positive. So that's what I did. I just set up the maps. I got the polynomial on here, and I just checked the criterion for every polynomial in sight. And that's how I proved that the vertex I thought was the winner in all cases was the winner. And then once I have the winner, I just I just compute what the map is, and And then that's the end of the story. So anyway, the idea is that like the polynomials you get in trying to prove this are sort of like slightly too much to do with by hand, unless you're really good at algebra, I think. Being lazy, I just use this method of positive dominance, I call it. I mean, there's other, this is kind of big business in maybe computational algebraic geometry. Like you have some polynomial and you want to know it's positive on some region. And so what do? Well, you could do this. This will work in n dimensions. There's some generalization. Or there's other kinds of, you can try to write the polynomial as a sum of squares of other polynomials. There's various things that people try with, more mixed success. And at some point I thought of this thing, and I like it because I just, it worked once and it's worked many times. So anyway, yeah, that's the end of it. The last thing I want to say is that the same sort of thing happens on the cube, and it's easier, more or less the same. And I'm embarrassed to say that I actually don't know what happens on the tetrahedron. I mean, somehow you'd think I would have done that case first, but the thing that, maybe it's, I wasn't able to find it in the literature, but what's better about the cube and the octahedron is that they have this antipodal map, so it kind of makes it nicer. But for probably it's a nice answer for the other Platonic solids. I just didn't work it out. Let me just show you a link. Then this will be the end of the talk. So that's my website, and then if you go to publications and you click on this, you can read this paper. I mean, it's got all those pictures, just sort of. Anyway, it's basically, I just took the program and put it into the paper. So if any of you guys is interested in this, you can read about it here. And there's also, I mean, I didn't talk too much about this in the past. I mean, there's a bunch of references of other papers in the back. So if you're interested in, other things about this, there's places. And then the last thing is that if you can click the download, and this will give you the program, you can try to use it. If you have a Java compiler, you can run it. Yeah, so that's it.
Okay, thank you. I just had a question a bit earlier. So when we got the J shape, right, is it directly obvious that we should get that we should divide our fundamental triangle into two parts rather than, say, more?
No. Okay, so let me tell you something about that. That's a good question. So I had a PhD student named Zili Wang. Zili looked at this on like more general kinds of octahedra. Just like all the cone angles are supposed to be the same as the regular one, and it should be centrally symmetric, but otherwise it's not. And then she also tried to find these various regions where the thing splits apart. And it basically, it kind of looks like a mess. So if you go away from the regular octahedron, there's kind of like many different zones and stuff. So I'd say like the answer to your question is it's not obvious at all. And in fact, for more general things, it doesn't work that way. It just somehow is like very clean for the regular octahedron. I mean, this is why I asked her to, I thought this would be a good project. I was hoping like, oh, there's going to be some beautiful answer for the general, like a more general thing. But I mean, it turned out to be pretty cool, but it didn't have the same like crisp sort of feel to it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I hope that made sense for you guys.
Yeah, I guess if there aren't any questions, let's just thank the speaker. Thanks. This was really interesting. Yeah, and because we slightly messed up and didn't introduce you at the beginning, sorry about this. Just so that everyone knows who this was. This is Professor Richard Evan Schwartz. He's a Chancellor Professor at Brown University, which is in Rhode Island. And as you can probably guess from the talk, he studies geometric group theory. And he also writes picture books about maths.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Actually, I had a question. What happens when you look at different polyhedra? So if you looked at like other regular ones, like, I don't know, like a dodecahedron?
Right, yeah, that's a really good question. So for the cube, okay, so for the cube, the answer is somewhat like what I described for the octahedron, but a little bit simpler. For the icosahedron, it should be about the same as the octahedron. For the tetrahedron, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out, but I don't know the answer. For the dodecahedron, I just have no idea. Like, that would be a really fun one to do, actually. I think people kind of don't know. But, you know, I thought about trying that. I mean, I'm not sure if I will, but and then the other case I was saying is that my graduate student, Zili Wang, she looked at other octahedra, other centrally symmetric octahedra. And she, you know, I'd say she proved some of the same things that I proved in this case, but sort of more general and less specific, you might say. But, you know, I kind of like these kinds of problems where, like, you have a family, like you could look at all possible tetrahedra and you could say, like, how does the map change as you vary the tetrahedron? And I mean, yeah, like I said, I feel a little bit stupid because somehow I just got into this because of my friend Peter, and then I was so focused on the octahedron, I didn't think about, like, what happens for the tetrahedron, you know. So, but again, it's not centrally symmetric, so it's a slightly different, you know, probably. But, you know, my guess is I would say that in general, the answer is that it should be piecewise algebraic. Like there are these zones, should be able to break the thing up into zones, and in each zone, the map should be given by a ratio of polynomials or something in the right coordinates. So I actually think it's like a good thing to study because, you know, you can take your pick, you know, you can try your favorite. Again, there's been some work done on this for general convex shapes, and there are some references in the paper.
To ask another question, but the most surprising thing for me was that they were in fact bilinear maps, so Mobius transforms on the single components. And
at least on the lines. I mean, if
on the lines. But do we have any?
On line, you get a different one. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any relation in how we have different Mobius transforms on each different line? Or maybe to ask the question concretely, what I kind of want to know is what happens to images of circles. So if I take a small circle, because whenever I see a Mobius transform, I want to map to a different circle.
So I mean, the paper. Okay, so one thing I can say is, like, you can write down the formula.
Okay.
And then, like, what happens to circles? That's a really good question. I mean, well, you know, they turn into some kind of, you know, algebraic blob.
Okay.
I mean,
so
they get compressed. So, like, so if the circle doesn't cross this J curve, it kind of gets squashed into the boundary. So it'll become, you know, more and more like a noodle and just.
But it's not something very simple, like just becoming elliptic, or it's going to be a bit more tricky.
I think so. It would be cool if it was an ellipse, but I don't think it is. I mean, actually, there were some additional things, like I actually wanted to sort of plot what happened to the J curve under both sides of the map. And I'll probably add that at some point to the program. But I mean, that's a really good intuition, a good instinct. Like when you have maps of a surface, it's a good idea to look at what happens to curves. So no, this will tell you a lot about what's going on, but I didn't think too much about what you actually get.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Do you think there might be some other geometry on the surface of the octahedron which could make the map even nicer? If you don't look at
that's a good. There is. So the other geometry that you would want to try would be hyperbolic geometry. If you know about hyperbolic geometry, it's like if you don't, it's a non-Euclidean version of the Euclidean plane, and it's got all the same stuff. It's got symmetries, it's got geodesics, you know, straight shortest paths, it's got triangles, polygons, and you can take eight identical triangles and glue them together and get a kind of hyperbolic octahedron. And probably the nicest one is where all the triangles are what's called ideal. It's sort of all the angles are 0. So this is what people call the ideal octahedron. And you can, like, look at that metric. There's an interesting thing when people study these flat surfaces a lot. there's somehow two geometries to them. One is there's like this kind of flat metric that I was talking about. And then there's also this hyperbolic metric, which comes from thinking about it as a Riemann surface and applying what's called the reuniformization theorem. And people sort of like study these things simultaneously. Like it's not exactly clear how the metrics are related, but somehow, you know, the thought is that one metric kind of gives information about the other and vice versa. And somehow like, it's like this other very, very symmetric metric on the octahedron. And, you know, it probably, yeah, it's probably an interesting thing to look at. I mean, I didn't try it, and some problems become like infinitely harder in hyperbolic geometry and some become easier. It's sort of a weird state of affairs, like, you know, sort of. So I guess I'm saying like that would be the other thing to try. Or you could make it out of spherical triangles and think about what happens like on a sphere, kind of a spherical cone metric, where it's like it looks like a sphere everywhere except it's 6 points. So that's also kind of a cool thing.
I mean, I was just going to say that if you did on a sphere, wouldn't this essentially be just a farthest point map into sphere, which is slightly boring?
It would be, but imagine now that you modified the metric on the sphere so that it was still spherical except at 6 points, and at these 6 points it had a it had the kind of looked like a kind of a spherical ice cream cone.
Yeah, okay.
So you can do that.
Yeah.
And I think these things are, I'd say, not well understood, even though, you know, people study these things. I think people are pretty interested in what's their geometry like, and I think these are kind of great projects for people, you know, students, undergrads, grad students, and you know, just because like you can sort of, if you like coding things, you can actually just try it. You know, you can eventually code it up and just see what happens. And, you know, then if you're lucky, you prove what you see. So, yeah. So anyway, those are like the three metrics you would try: hyperbolic, some kind of spherical thing, and flat.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So anyway, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, thanks for having me do this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.